Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Crystal Sheldon. I am the director for Java and Education at Oracle. And this is the fifth, I believe, webinar in this series on shuffling the deck of cards. So we have been building the deck of cards. We played our first game 2 weeks ago with them, and now we're going to shuffle the deck. Seems a little weird that we played the game before we shuffled the deck, but it was helpful when we came to debug the game to see if it was working properly. But now let's get to shuffling the deck because that's what makes card games more fun. So just to kind of recap where we were and where we're headed, we created an enum for the suit of the deck. We created an enum for the face of card. That enum also had whether or not the card was a face card. It also had card value in case our games needed those things. We created a record for a card that has a suit and a face value. Then we created a class for a deck of cards. We added a game class that had a deal method. And so this is the hierarchy of where we were. So we've got this record card that has two enums, suit and face of card. We've got this deck class that has a deck of cards. We added some methods to it. We've added a get top of card to it so that we can pull and deal cards. We added a game class that had a couple of players and had a deal method in there. One of the things that we've been talking about is how having the array lists in these separate classes really helps students to start to understand that the information is private and they have to figure out ways of passing those cards from the deck into the hand and back and forth between these classes and objects. We also added a player. The player has a hand, so it's holding cards as well. So the deck is separate from the hand. It's deck separate from what cards would be played in the game as well. There's multiple ways that we can shuffle the deck. This would be great to brainstorm with students. Array lists can be really a tricky topic. And so having this project where you can manipulate the array list in multiple different ways, the students could steer this whichever way they want to. They can come up with their own algorithms for shuffling decks of cards. I would recommend, if I was doing this in the classroom, I would have decks of cards available so students could play around and actually see concretely what is happening with algorithms. But here are three algorithms that we're going to explore. I'm not saying that they're the best, but these are the three we're going to explore. Of course, people could come up with all sorts of different ways. Students will be creative and come up with all sorts of different ways. So the first one that I thought made most sense was to move randomly selected cards to the end of the list or into a new list. So that's the first one. I kind of thought about that in different ways, and we're going to see how I settled on this randomly selecting, but basically selecting cards and adding them to the list. The second one is continuously selecting a card from the beginning and then adding that to and then the end and adding those to the new list. So you're grabbing a card from the beginning of the deck and then a card from the end of the deck. And you're going to keep doing that beginning, end, and kind of weaving those cards through. And then another one, which kind of to me mimics how you would physically shuffle cards, is split the deck into two and then alternate which card is going down first. So we have that algorithm that we're going to explore. The other thing I thought about when I was putting this together this week was sometimes you cut cards. So those are some other algorithms you could talk about. Sometimes you cut them once, sometimes you cut them multiple times. And so what does that look like to cut cards? And what does it look like to shuffle, then cut, then shuffle, then cut? And what's going to actually mix the cards well? So those are all great conversations to have in the classroom with students. Let's start with random shuffling. So the thought here is we have this deck of cards. I abbreviated it. I only put 4 cards in here just for this illustration, and a temporary deck. And say I draw a random number of 2. What I'm going to do is take the card at index 2 and I'm going to move it into, it was the 3 of diamonds. I'm going to remove it from the deck list, first of all. That's going to shift the ace of clubs down to now be at index 2. And then I'm going to add it into temporary deck. And so this is what it looks like after I do that. I would keep doing this repeatedly until there were no more cards in deck, and then I would set deck to temporary deck. So here's what the code looks like. We created a temporary deck, temp deck, and set it equal to a new array list. We have a while loop here, so while we still have cards in the deck, we are finding out how many we have with this deck.size, and then we are generating a random number. So here's another place where you can reinforce what's happening with random numbers. So with math.random, we know that we are generating a random number between 0 and 1, including 0 but not including 1. And then we're multiplying that by the number of elements we get. So we get a number between 0 and 0.999 times that number of elements. So if we had 52 cards, for example, we would get a random value between 0 and 51.999. And if we had 10 cards, we would get 0 to 9.9999. And then what the int does is it truncates the decimal portion of that off. So the decimal portion is going to come off of there, and we'll get, for 52 cards, we'll get a value between 0 and 51, which are the index values for our array list. And for 10 cards, we'll get 0 to 9. And then, like I said, we're going to remove a card from the deck. So I took out the 3 of diamonds, and then we are going to add it into the temporary deck. And then deck will equal temp deck at the end. Once I did one pass, this is just one example. Of course, every time you run this, it'll look very differently because your random numbers will generate different values. So it actually looks halfway decent in terms of being shuffled after doing this one time. We do have some, like a couple spades together, but I think that's pretty natural. A couple hearts together. We've got a good mix of values there. And you could just run, call this shuffle cards random like 3 or 4 times and maybe see an even better representation. Okay, this idea of selecting from the beginning and then the end is another idea you could come up with. So we're going to take the beginning value, the 5 of hearts, we're going to put that into the temporary deck. So we removed it from deck. We're going to add it into temporary deck. Everything's shifted down in deck. And then we're going to take the 1 at the end, the ace of clubs, and we're going to add it to temporary deck. And we would keep doing this, move the 4 of spades over, then the 3 of diamonds over until deck had no values in it any longer. And we'll see what happens with that. So here's the code. We have to create a temporary deck again, and it's just a simple little while loop. So while I still have at least 2 cards in the deck, I'm going to do this where I'm going to do remove the first and remove the last. Remove first and remove last, if you're not familiar with those, they're relatively new from Java 21. They come from the sequence collection class, which is implemented by ArrayList. So these are methods that are available when you use ArrayList. If you are looking to learn more about sequence collections, we do have a tutorial on our learn.java page at learn.java/learning/tutorials/sequenced collections. So here's what it looked like before, and this is one iteration. You see it's not very random at all. We've got an ace of hearts, then the king of diamonds, then the 2 of hearts, and the queen of diamonds. We're kind of going back and forth. If we run this multiple times, does it get better? So what happens if we run it 10 times? So here's what's happened when we've run it 10 times. It does look much better after 10 runs. One thing that I do notice is that that first card, that ace of hearts, is still at the beginning. So that's one thing to kind of think about. Okay. The third algorithm that we're going to look at is splitting the list into 2 and then every other card. This is kind of how I shuffle cards. Of course, when I shuffle manually, I'm not perfect. I don't get a perfect split. I don't get a perfect every other. What happens in the computer when you do? So we've got this deck. We're going to split it in 2. So I'm going to take the front of the deck and I'm going to put it in an array list called front. And then I've got the back of the deck is in deck still. And now I'm going to create a temporary deck, and I'm just going to alternate pulling from deck and then from front of deck. and you can see how that would work. Okay, so now I've got my temporary deck. I'm going to assign that back to deck and I'm done. So what does this code look like? I've got to create 2 array lists now, one for the front of the deck, and I could do back of the deck too, but since deck would have those values, I just kind of left it alone. And then temp for the temporary deck. But you could also have pulled front and then the back of the deck and then merged them into deck itself, and that would be fine too. Here I am pulling the first half of the deck into front of deck, again using that remove first from sequenced collection. And then I'm doing the alternating, removing from the front deck array list and the deck array list to create temp deck. And you're going to see something a little similar here. It's slightly different because where we split it. So after first run, you've got all hearts and diamonds at the beginning. After 10 runs, it's a much more representative shuffle, but notice that the first card remains the same in this method as well. So that's an issue that I would want to explore more, and how do we maybe alternate which deck gets the value pulled first, whether it's the front of the deck one or deck. So we could maybe alternate that. And maybe each time we call this, it does it twice. It splits twice, and one time it pulls from front of the deck first, and the other time it pulls from deck first. And that would be a way to get that ace of hearts off the beginning. So hopefully this gives you some ideas. There's lots of different ways that you could do this with students. Our next and final card challenge is going to be to create a visualization. We're going to use text blocks to do that. So if you're not familiar with text blocks, now's your chance to become familiar with it. And we will have the challenge up on the learn.java site for you to look at, maybe try with your students, and we will be creating some visualizations of some cards. And then that will be the final webinar in this card series. Thank you for attending today, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.